Hello, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Lash's Digital Classroom. Today, I'm going to be talking about the downfall of the constitutional monarchy in revolutionary France. Now, when we talk about the downfall of the constitutional monarchy, what we're talking about is the end of that period between the absolutist monarchy of Louis XVI and the Republican France of the later 1790s. When we talk about this now, there are two really pressures that are causing the downfall. One internal, the other external. The internal one is the same pressures that caused the revolution in the first place. We're talking about the social class between the urban workers and commoners and the middle class and the elites. There's also that pressure that we've discussed before about the people living in the cities and the people living in the countryside. So there's a number of different factions, all dissatisfied with Louis XVI. There are also, however, external pressures, and that's what we're going to start with. The foreign reaction to the French Revolution. Now, outside of France, the initial response was mixed, especially in a place like England. The working class and peasants of England broadly supported the revolution. They liked the idea of more rights, they liked the idea of property redistribution, they liked the idea of an extended representative assembly, less influence of the nobility in government, all things that the working class and peasants in England favored. The middle class in England broadly supported the initial stages of the revolution. They liked the idea of a limited monarchy. They disliked the idea of the absolutist monarchy of the French. And you also have to keep in mind that for the English, the French were sort of the old enemy. So they were happy to see that the government changing. Now, the British upper class rejected it outright. They disliked the idea of removing the monarchy from power. While they were okay with constitutional changes within the English context, these extra constitutional measures terrified them. And the voice of the British upper class is going to be best captured by Edmund Burke. And we'll label him a conservative, and he's really the founder of conservative ideology. He'll argue that the government does have a responsibility to the future generations, but it also has a responsibility to maintain the traditions of the past. He strongly supported the rights of the nobility and the rights of the king, and disliked any talk of limiting those rights. Now, outside of England, you also have the states of Austria, Prussia, Russia, the other major powers of Europe. For those states, they were terrified of the French Revolution because France was the model absolutist monarchy. It's the absolutist monarchy that all the other absolutist monarchies looked up to. So if France could be overtaken, and remember, one of the things that allowed an absolutist monarchy to come to power was the centralization of military authority under the king and standing armies. Well, for Louis XVI, that standing army had in many ways sort of failed him. So Austria, Prussia, Russia, watching this happen in France, they're going to want to move to actively stop the changes happening in France. Which will bring us to war in 1792. Austria and Prussia are going to pledge to restore the powers of Louis XVI. Now, this is going to put Louis in an incredibly awkward situation because Louis gave up many of those powers. Now, remember, we talked about the personality of Louis. He really wanted to be liked. So when he gives up these powers, he's doing it because, as king, he thinks this is the best thing for his country. So he's put in this position where outside there are these kings who are demanding that Louis gets all of his powers back, and inside France you have Louis who's basically begging the National Assembly to believe him when he says, I'm not talking to these guys. These guys don't speak for me. Well, those pleadings of Louis XVI become hard to believe when there are these early victories by Prussia and Austria against France. And it's really going to threaten the government. So the French government will respond by mobilizing the entire nation. This includes that urban mob. And as we've seen before with the urban mob and the storming of the Bastille, they're not really under control. Right? They kind of do their own thing. So when the people are called up and they're called to rally, there's rumors that Louis XVI is working with Austria and Prussia, which is not all that radical of a thing to believe. The mob will attack the palace that the king lived in, which ironically was also the same palace which held the National Assembly. The mob will storm the palace, switching the sides of some of the National Guard while they're attacking, and the king will flee to the National Assembly. And the National Assembly will, rather than protect him, will actually arrest him. Now, here we have actually a contemporary painting of the event, and if we look at this painting, there's a couple things that we should notice. First, we should look at the fact that it appears to be more of a set battle than an actual sort of mob attacking the palace. What we should get from this is, first and foremost, that this is propaganda. Right? This is propaganda of the French Revolution. They are promoting an idea. You have on the right the French people, and on the left you have the Swiss Guard protecting the king. In many ways, people argue that the Swiss Guard was massacred. You'll notice that many of the soldiers fighting for the French people in this context were actually the National Guard, soldiers that should have been protecting Louis. When the mob came, however, many of them switched sides and attacked the Swiss Guard, the king's personal bodyguard. You'll also note that the combat probably wasn't quite so vicious, considering that the National Assembly was housed in the same palace, right? But this is meant to convey a certain idea, right? It's much like the Bastille. It's part of the creation of a mythology, right? A triumphant defeat of the absolutist king. And if that painting is any indication, it's really sort of the indication of the bloody beginnings of the second revolution. Now, when we talk about the second revolution, as I said, there are some bloody beginnings. These bloody beginnings are going to be both actions against the king, which we'll talk about in a second, and also anyone who is really deemed counter-revolutionary. This is the first time that we begin to see that this urban mob cannot be controlled, that they are going to be more radical and more violent than many people are comfortable with, especially the middle class. Now, prior to the beginning of the Second Revolution, we had the creation of what were called Jacobin clubs. These Jacobin clubs were essentially political clubs where people came together and debated politics. It's from the Jacobin clubs that the National Convention will be called. The National Convention will be brought together after the capture of King Louis XVI, and they're really going to come together to create a new government. And we can divide the National Convention into two groups. The first are the Girondists. These were moderates who had middle-class values, who wanted the establishment of a republic, but a more moderate republic. Then you have the Mountain, led by the famous Robespierre. They were much more radical, and they were skeptical of any traditional structures of authority. This included, of course, the king, the nobility, the Catholic Church. They wanted to tear it all down, right, and rebuild something new in its place, based on what they perceived as Enlightenment values. But before they could do that, they had to execute or somehow eliminate King Louis XVI. And the Girondists and the Mountain are going to be divided on how to do that. The Girondists believe in simply imprisoning the king for the rest of his life, or potentially exiling the king. The Mountain supported execution. Now, there was no doubt and no argument over the king's guilt. Both sides agreed that the king was guilty. Either he, didn't oppose the Austrians and the Prussians strong enough, or they just honestly believed that the king had been communicating with them. In either case, the Mountain is going to win, and King Louis XVI will be executed on January 21st, 1793. The accounts of his execution have varied. Most agree that he was resigned to the fact. He didn't beg for his life. He didn't plead. He declared his innocence to the very end. But this act will horrify the British middle class. It's the execution of Louis that is going to really mobilize England against France. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the days to come. Once the king is executed, you have to create a new government in his place. Now, the Girondins and the Mountain both agreed that a republic was the way to go, but they were bitterly divided as to the nature of that republic. Right? The Girondins, again, wanted a more moderate change in the republic. They agree that they wanted, wide voting rights, but really they just wanted to make sure that the middle class maintained sort of political authority over the system. The Mountain was much more radical. Right? They wanted a much more democratic system in the sense that they had direct elections, equal representation, and less social distinction. The Mountain will mobilize the urban poor, known as the sans-culottes, and using force, remove the prominent Girondins from the convention. Right? And this is really going to be the method that the Mountain will use to govern. The prominent Girondins will be removed, some will be executed, and they will establish the Committee for Public Safety. The Committee for Public Safety will be run by Robespierre and will essentially set forth the second sort of period of the French Revolution. Thank you for listening.